Hello, my scary friends. This Chinese lamp is annoying me. Be sure to subscribe to my channel. Hey, guys, I found something in the woods near my house. It's an old leather-bound journal of sorts. Reading it was surreal. I'm going to transcribe it here for everyone. If people like it, I may transcribe more for you all. Here goes. I'm not sure if anyone will ever read this, honestly. Even if someone did read this, they would likely pass it off as just another creepypasta. Call this a journal, call it a confession, call it whatever you like. For me, this is a way to cope with some of the things I've seen and done. Perhaps the beginning is the best place to start. I lead a normal life up until my 23rd birthday. I was only concerned about going to the bar on the weekend, and whether the Oilers would win their next game. I can't remember the last time I watched a game of hockey. I frequented a local boxing club. Most of the guys there liked to hit the gym. I liked to hit those guys. It brought me a sense of vindication, of power. Huge muscle-bound gym freaks were always so cocky, stepping into the ring sure of their victory simply because they were strong. I was not an imposing figure myself. That might be partly why they always looked so sure. When the fight would start, I considered my opponent as prey, something to be hunted. I was fast. It was easy to avoid the strong punches they would throw, trying to end the fight quickly and establish dominance. Duck, bob left, fake right, dodge left, circle, work on the ribs, back off. Like a coyote picking at a larger animal. It took time. These types of guys could take a beating, but consistency always paid off. I'm getting off track. It was at this boxing club that I was first recruited. That was a lifetime ago. After a particularly long flight, with a particularly stubborn opponent, I was toweling the sweat from my face, careful to avoid antagonizing the bruise swelling around my left eye. Hey, I said they were easy to take down, not that I was invincible. Anyway, this guy clearly did not belong here. A suit and tie, briefcase, black glasses. I thought maybe he was a scout looking for a fighter. I guess I wasn't far off. The man did offer me a job. He just called it a hunting job. He couldn't tell me much about the specifics, saying it needed to know, and unless I signed I didn't need to know. There was a waiver. I read this carefully. It was very vague but clearly indicated the job could result in my mortality. This gave me pause, but the six-figure salary pushed my doubts away. This was more money than I had dreamed of making. I couldn't turn it down. My first months were training, not just physical but also mental. Let me tell you, I thought this was some joke for a TV show or something. I kept expecting people to burst out laughing, cameras in my face, saying how they had got me. Half of my day was studying in a tiny classroom with a handful of other recruits. The other half was physical training, stretching, cardio, strength training, obstacles, stretching. It was grueling, but the vetting process must have been thorough. No one dropped out. Even the guys who were clearly past breaking somehow managed to dig deep and pull through whatever physical torture they could lump on us. I guess mental determination was as important as physical ability when scouting new recruits. The studying was what really made me believe this was all some TV show. Our first day we learned about werewolves. Each day we learned about something new: vampires, skinwalkers, mermaids, even dragons. Unreal. None of it seemed like it could possibly be a reality until after the first month. We got to see a real cryptid. They explained that this one was called a haunter, a catch from a recent hunt. It was our first hands-on experience. Haunters aren't too bad. It's a physical manifestation of greed. They can turn invisible, which makes them a pain to track. Once you manage to track them though, it's game over. I remember looking into that cage, seeing nothing. The instructor tossed a gold coin into the cage which we all watched levitate, and then disappear. Another gold coin was held out, a short distance from the cage. It rattled as if something was trying to get out. And then we saw it. Incorporeal at first, it seemed to just fade into existence from the emptiness of the cage. It had no legs and just kind of hovered, bobbing in the space. It had these piercing yellow eyes. They looked like cat's eyes. Two disembodied hands were reaching between the bars for the gold coin, grasping. We watched as the instructor tossed it towards the creature, who snagged it midair and deposited it into the wide grinning maw. Haunters usually make a lair for themselves, like a Hollywood dragon hoard. It will be piled with currency, coins, gold, baubles, and people. You see, haunters feed on the greediest of souls. They are drawn to them like a magnet. They stalk around invisibly, and when they find someone who is particularly greedy, they literally haunt them. Something about their presence sends a person's greed into overdrive. The haunter will whisper thoughts to the victim, describing where a hoard of gold, silver and all the money you can eat can be found. It will implant images into the victim's head, showing them the path to a glittering stash. Eventually, the victim will succumb, seeking out this supposed boon for themselves, usually in a cave. Once they enter, it is too late. Have you ever seen a moth enthralled by a light? It is kinda like that. The victim just stands there unblinking, like a statue. We aren't sure how the haunter feeds, just that eventually the victim will die, seemingly from malnourishment, something that would normally take weeks. For the victim, this happens in about 24 hours, and then they just collapse. Corpses will line the lair, desiccated, looking like so many cancer victims. If you've seen someone with cancer, emaciated and barely alive, you'll know what I'm talking about. Anyway, this was my first real encounter, when I knew it wasn't some bloated TV show dragging things on for others' amusement. It was at this point I was glad I had played along, dutifully taking notes and actually studying the material we had been given. The training up until this point had covered most of the Hollywood monsters like the ones listed above. After the demonstration with the haunter, we started to learn about other cryptids that weren't as well known. Things like the Diabolo, Longcat, Dopes, and Whiskers. If anyone manages to find this, you likely won't know what these are. Stick with this text long enough and you might learn about them. By this point I've hunted and fought almost all of them. After training was over, we were each assigned a town or city as a base of operations. Everyone was given a dossier with the information we would need. Local contacts, mostly other hunters, arms dealers, and a safe house. I was assigned to Cold Lake, Alberta, a small town north of Edmonton. Hard to believe it, but cryptids live closer to humanity than anyone could realize. Hunters are the ones who maintain that line of separation, keeping the monsters from under your bed, and the boogeyman out of your closet. My safe house was located just outside of town, likely to keep away most prying eyes. I can't imagine that locals would react well to seeing some of the creatures I've brought home being unloaded from the back of my truck. I am not going to include specific details on locations of safe houses and dealers, for obvious reasons. While I am writing this for myself, if it ever did get out to the public, these locations need to be safeguarded. As a fresh recruit, I wasn't allowed to take on hunts alone yet. I was to be accompanied by a local hunter, at least until I had demonstrated a firm understanding of the dangers of the job and protocols around keeping the public unaware. I guess the organization I worked for wanted to protect their investment. Lenny, not his real name, was my chaperone, the experienced hunter. He was in his 40s and had been doing this for a while by the looks of it. Angry scars were visible on his body from only God knows what kind of creature. Despite his piercing eyes, he wore a smile on his face that betrayed his excitement to teach a new hunter. He had an unlabeled manila envelope in his hand, the other extended to shake my own. I invited him in and we discussed over coffee my first assignment. He was impressed that I had retained the information from my training on werewolves. Day 1 training when most guys still didn't take it seriously. Hollywood got it right. Silver hurts werewolves, prevents the regenerative properties they have. They are feral and not the best at reasoning, the animalistic nature of the wolf inside them taking precedence. The human counterpart has no memory of their time as a werewolf. Blood on their naked body explained away as a nosebleed, missing pajamas as sleepwalking. Hollywood did get one thing wrong though. The moon has no bearing on when a person turns. Instead, the transformation can be triggered by particularly strong emotions, especially anger, usually when brought on by a dream. Fortunately for most, lycanthropy isn't passed on. There isn't usually a victim left after an attack. Anyway, on to the meat and potatoes. Lenny gave me the rundown. Recent animal mutilations in the woods near town had hit the paper. Luckily no person had been killed yet. We needed to investigate. Chances are it was a werewolf based on the pictures Lenny had of the ruined animal carcasses. Most had been found within a short distance of each other, which really helped narrow our search. We spent the day preparing and I got to purchase my first weapon from Tommy, the local arms supplier. I think he thought his moniker was clever, likely referencing a Tommy gun. I settled for a lever-action 30-30, enough stopping power to slow a werewolf and enough punch to put the bullets deep into the chest cavity. 5 bullets, quick action, and no scope. We would be too close for that. We set up in the area where the recent attacks had happened and laid our trap. This work is dirty work. Sometimes evil must be done to prevent true evil gaining a foothold. I felt terribly watching the poor goat in the clearing ahead of us from my tree perch. We had tied the goat to a stake in the ground central in the clearing in front of me. I can still remember the pitiful bleating as it dragged its broken leg, attempting to escape. This was necessary. We needed to lure in the creature. At least this is what I told myself. What I still tell myself. Between the fresh smell of injury and the distressed calls of the animal, if tonight was a night where our target turned, we would surely see it. Hopefully, the commotion would also prevent the werewolf from noticing us, too focused on the easier prey. Werewolves were not typically cautious. As I scanned the opposite end of the clearing for Lenny, who was likewise in a tree stand, my attention was drawn to the left of the clearing. A terrible crashing of brush echoed as I saw a blur of fur that covered the 40 or so feet to the goat in a second. Thankfully the bleating had stopped. Now it was replaced by the sound of flesh ripping and tendons tearing. I was shocked into stunned silence for a second at the sheer ferocity of the creature. Truly the texts had not done a good enough job of conveying the brutality contained in a single creature. Several loud reports echoed through the clearing as Lenny took his shot and revealed himself. He had elected to bring an M4 rifle with a selector for single burst and auto, strapping a sawed-off shotgun to his leg. Ha! In hindsight, maybe I should have taken his lead and not gone the John Wayne cowboy route with my lever action. Regardless, the time to act was quickly passing as the creature barreled towards the perceived threat, Lenny. The cryptid was nearly 9 feet tall and pure muscle. Bounding up the 20 feet of the tree to rip Lenny from his stand would be easy for it, and it had already covered most of the distance. I lined up my shot and let my breath out as I squeezed the trigger, just like training. The gun exploded in my hands as the butt of the rifle impacted hard into my shoulder. The muzzle flash temporarily blinded me before I saw that I had connected my shot. The larger caliber of my weapon and the momentum of charging Lenny had knocked the cryptid onto its chest as my shot impacted square in the middle of its back. Before I could even move or chamber a second round, I saw Lenny ride a rope to the bottom of his tree. He took measured paces and closed the remaining distance to the flailing and hollering creature trying to tear into its own flesh and pull the burning silver out. Before the werewolf could react, Lenny had the sword off in hand and pressed to the creature's head. A final resounding boom echoed around the clearing before silence fell. I lowered myself from the tree and walked past the ravaged corpse of the goat. Yup, definitely like the pictures I had seen in the dossier from earlier. I made my way over to the now still corpse of the werewolf. Lenny had put on a set of leather gloves and was inspecting the corpse. It didn't change back to the person it had been. I'm thankful for that at least. It was much easier to be okay with what had just transpired when you knew what you killed had no humanity, that it was only a monster. We had to inspect the body to ensure there were no abnormalities, that it was in fact dead and wouldn't be getting up to cause more trouble. The holes from several entry wounds let out a quiet sizzle and smoke poured from the wounds. I could see that the shotgun had been loaded with silver buck, the mortal wound to the head preventing any form of regeneration. Werewolves are big tough bastards and this one was no exception. It took the both of us to drag the body back to my truck. As this was my first hunt, I got the task of dealing with the leftovers, part of the job. We made it back to my place and Lenny reminded me not to go sticking my hand in its mouth. If I cut myself this way, he would be hunting me down next. I pulled the body into the shop behind my house and began the grisly task of cutting it into more manageable pieces. I couldn't resist taking a tooth. It was my first hunt after all. I buried the individual parts and made my way inside, washed up, and Lenny and I recounted the evening over steak and eggs. It didn't take long for Lenny to give his stamp of approval to the body that governed us as hunters. You know, to this day I have never learned the name of the organization that I work for. I am confident it is a does not exist branch of the government, if only because I can't imagine why a private company would fund an operation like this. I could see a black market for cryptid parts. People pay for much less interesting stuff, but we dispose of the cryptids we hunt. Anyway, the only way to contact upper management is via prepaid pre-addressed envelopes that are left in the safe houses. These are for reporting non-assignment cryptids that we might stumble across on our own. We also fill out a report for every assignment to ship off to whoever is in charge. The return envelope for these comes in the manila envelopes. Our assignments are delivered overnight, slipped under the door or through a mail slot into the safe house. One night I happened to be up late and heard the mail slot clink shut. I sprinted to the door to try and get a glimpse of the person delivering my assignment, and I saw him. Not that I could ever point him out in a crowd. It was your typical governmental boogeyman. Black suit, tie, glasses, and a buzz cut. He drove a black SUV and appeared to be alone. Anyway, I didn't dig. Best not to. I had grown to love this job, and why mess with a good thing? I guess I should brag if I had anyone to brag to other than this little book. Most hunters are on probation for years, but with Lenny guiding my hand and teaching me the things you don't learn in training, I managed to get that solo hunter stamp of approval within a year. One thing that is worth reminding me is that this is a dangerous job. Most hunters are dead before they hit 40. Just because you can do jobs alone doesn't mean it is always the best idea. That is something I learned from Lenny. He was solemn when he told me he was giving me that approval. He was sure I could handle myself, but he made damn sure to put everything into perspective. I was here in Cold Lake because the last person who lived in this house My safe house was a girl by the name of Allison. I say was because she got her stamp, and then she died on the first job she went out on. Lenny didn't want to tell me what got her, but he did tell me not to worry. He had been the one to ensure the monster paid. He had trained her, he had given her that stamp. I imagine he also felt like he killed her himself. I didn't want to pry. Lenny would tell me more about Allison in good time if he wanted. I'm pretty sure he liked this Allison. I didn't ask at the time, but he always wore an unadorned chain with a gold ring on it, and I would find out later that this was his reminder. This was his memory of Allison. I recall an assignment that really got to me, mostly because it wasn't an assignment. This cryptid found me. That is something you must keep in mind doing this job. Just because you are a hunter doesn't mean you can't become the hunted. Life is a roller coaster of adrenaline surges and dull monotonous waiting. The waiting is the worst. It's easy to let your guard down. It's easy to let the monsters in. Lenny and I worked together, for the most part, him assisting on my assignments and vice versa. The buddy system was usually the best choice. That is why I didn't blink when I heard the knock at my door. I kept a sidearm on me at all times now. You get that way when you're paranoid about being devoured alive, burnt from the inside out, or worse. As always, I peeked through the side window to see who was at the door before anything else. It was Lenny. He must have gotten another assignment and wanted to pull me in on it. I opened the door without hesitation and motioned for him to come inside. I already had my back turned. There was breakfast on the stove, and I didn't want it to burn. I didn't see the awkward gait. I didn't notice the vacant expression on his face. As I flipped the eggs in the pan. Once over easy is the only way to eat eggs. One of the yolks broke. Now I didn't know it at the time, but this minor error, well, it saved my life. I turned to ask Lenny to grab me another egg from the fridge just as his form tumbled onto mine. The first thing that hit me, other than the buck knife sinking into my shoulder, was the wave of fetid breath. I nearly retched right there and may have if it wasn't for the fact I hadn't eaten anything yet. I was still clutching the frying pan in my right hand, my left hand was focused on stopping the blade from sinking any deeper and causing more damage. I still wasn't sure if this really was Lenny. Perhaps he had been possessed by a demon, a poltergeist, or something else. That is why I didn't reach for my sidearm. I had lost a portion of my humanity doing this job and I wasn't willing to shoot my mentor in the head. I would die first. Instead, I opted to clock Lenny in the head with the fry pan. It didn't even faze him, and I could feel the blade gain another half-inch into my body. I thought for sure this was it. I was going to die like this, without even eating breakfast. I dropped the pan and reached into the nearest cupboard as we fought on the floor. It pays to be prepared in this line of work. I pulled the pin on the hard metal object and closed my eyes. My ears would suffer. It took another few seconds, the blade gaining more depth on my body before the flashbang erupted in the now open cabinet. This did the trick. I felt the knife leave my body as I heaved Lenny off me with all my might. My eyes were fine, but I couldn't hear anything other than a low whine and I was pretty sure both my ears were bleeding. Lenny wasn't so lucky. He had been too focused on getting that blade into my chest to realize what was happening. I took advantage of the brief moments I had to stomp on his wrist and kick the knife out of his hand. Pretty sure I broke parts of it. Not that I could hear the bones cracking. He would forgive me for that if this really was Lenny. I leapt on top of him and tried to wrestle him into submission. He was strong, too strong. I managed to get some paracord around his wrists first, and then his ankles. I needed to find out what was going on. I sat him in the kitchen chair. put out the beginning of the fire in my cupboard, and took a moment to myself, just staring across the room at my friend. Lenny stared back. He was calm and still. I waited for the tinny ringing in my ears to stop. I racked my brain thinking about what I knew. That's also something Lenny taught me. In a high-stress situation where you don't know what you are fighting, the wrong choice can kill you. In this case, it could kill my friend too. I mentally checked off things: increased strength, sewer breathes, the drive to kill hunters. At least moderately intelligent. I walked over to Lenny and began poring over his body for more clues, careful to watch for any sudden attack. There was no attack forthcoming. He just stared at me with the same blank expression he had been wearing for the past half hour. He had the same scars as Lenny. He had the same hair. His entire body was identical. No glowing runes hidden under the clothes. No parasite latched at the base of his skull. Then I noticed the necklace where that golden ring was missing. I had never seen Lenny without that ring. I didn't let on that I knew this. I questioned him, asking him what he was, asking him questions only Lenny could answer. He didn't respond. Instead, a sickening smile spread wider across his face with each new question. I was pretty sure this wasn't Lenny, but I couldn't be sure just yet. I examined the hand I had kicked the knife from. It was broken in a few places. I squeezed as hard as I could and there was no pain response. The clues I had so far narrowed it down to 2 cryptids that I could think of. This was either a demon or a doppelganger. I had never dealt with either before, but I was certain it wasn't a demon. From what I knew, a demon couldn't help but taunt you. Demons are notoriously difficult to kill. Usually, the host body is just destroyed, and they move on to another. It's a sad fact that the human body can't handle the exorcism rites that shred them from reality. Unless this was a demon playing some kind of long con, it had to be a doppelganger. If this was a demon, it would likely just break Lenny's wrists and hands into pulp until it could wriggle free of the restraints. Unless I was there to stop it. I took a risk, yet another Lenny lesson: know when to risk the biscuit. I went to my shop to get the tools I would need. I had a wall full of weapons at this point, including the 30-30 from my first hunt. Even though it was impractical, I liked it. I grabbed a 12-volt battery off my bench and tools to pry it open with, lugging it back into my kitchen. This would be messy. It took me a while to crack into that battery, and that damn creature just kept smiling at me the whole time. That smile faded when I had finally cracked the battery open, which confirmed my suspicion. This had to be a doppelganger. I poured the battery acid on top of its head and watched as human skin sloughed off onto the floor into a gooey puddle. When I was done, all that was left was the doppelganger in its true form. You know, the greys. The most iconic image of an alien was the closest I can come to describing the creature, although the skin was completely see-through, and they had a normal-sized head and eyes. I needed it to talk, to tell me why it was wearing Lenny if he was still alive. I unclipped the homemade knife from my belt. Remember that werewolf fang? It was perfectly safe after you cleaned off the saliva. That is what carried the lycanthropy virus. Werewolf fangs are sharp though, and I used that fang to cut a gash down the center of the creature's chest, opening it up and pressing the knife to its heart. I asked the questions I needed to know. Where was Lenny? Was he alive? I wasn't concerned about motive. I'm pretty sure killing some hunters was motive enough. After all, we hunted these things. The creature just smiled again. I plunged that fang into its heart and twisted, watching fountains of black blood erupted from the gash it left. It would be dead before long. I needed to find Lenny. I ran for my truck and broke every traffic law imaginable to get to where Lenny's safe house was. I passed a police cruiser. Fortunately, it was one of the officers in the know and he didn't even turn on his lights. Some officers are employed by my organization as informants, you could call them. It pays to have eyes and ears where the public goes when you fight the things we do. I got to Lenny's and kicked open the door. My sidearm drew just in case any other doppelgangers had made a home here. I found Lenny all right. He was in his kitchen just like I had been. Burnt breakfast was smoking on the stove. Lenny always woke up before I did. The creature must have come here first. It must have been trying to kill 2 hunters in one go. We were the only 2 in town. That would have increased its odds of escape back into the general populace. His blood was still spilling onto the floor and he was unconscious. I did first aid as best I could and drove him like a bat out of hell to the hospital. Lenny lived. I guess the creature had been hunting us. It showed up at his door that morning as me. It knocked him unconscious and stabbed him in the chest. It was a bad wound, but it had missed his heart. We always greet each other a certain way now, as a precaution. You can never be too prepared in my line of work. You can never really count on tomorrow. You have to live for today. And when Lenny finally got out of the hospital, we had a few drinks at the local sports bar, Taps. That was the first time I had to fill out a report for the organization that wasn't an assignment, but it certainly wasn't the last.